there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Hi, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented by 3 self-certified TEFLologists.
TEFL Pioneers.
Today's TEFL pioneer is John Locke.
Okay.
Have you heard of John Locke?
The character from Lost?
No? Incorrect.
His namesake.
Okay, I've never watched Lost.
Oh, right, yeah, there's a character called John Locke.
Alright, isn't it just a series of trapdoors leading nowhere?
Yep.
Okay, so John Locke was an English philosopher and physician, born in 1632.
Mm-hmm.
He's quite well known as an early proponent of empiricism, which is...
Which is being very empirical about things.
Yeah, which means...
Yes or no, black and white.
Collecting evidence.
Yeah,
It's
testing.
a sort of evidence. Like, yeah.
Yeah. So he was born in Rington, Somerset, to a Puritan family. His father had served as a parliamentarian during the English Civil War.
Ooh.
So this is the period of history we're talking
Yeah.
about. He was educated at Westminster School, which is quite a prestigious school, and he entered Christ Church College at Oxford at the age of 20. He's best known for his philosophical works, including 2 treatises on government and an essay concerning human understanding, which I'm sure you've got very dogged copies of in your bookshelves. However, for our purposes, he also wrote a book called Some Thoughts Concerning Education, which was also very influential.
These are the titles of the books.
Yeah, this is what book titles were like back in the day. In fact, if you look at his Wikipedia page, it has like his list of works, and this Some Thoughts Concerning Education is one of the only ones that links onto its own Wikipedia page, which shows how influential it was. So this was at a time when children still studied Latin as their main foreign language, and the way they studied it was through writing poems, speeches in Latin, that kind of thing. And this is despite the fact that Latin was, of course, a dead language.
Still is.
Yes. So we haven't had the Latin revival yet. So in 1684, Locke wrote Some Thoughts Concerning Education. He was asked by his friend Edward Clarke for some advice on raising his son, Edward Jr., and they corresponded on the book for some time. They corresponded on the subject for some time. So these were letters they were writing back and forth, with John Locke advising his friend about how to raise his child. And eventually, Edward Clarke and some other people convinced Locke that the letters should be published in the form of a book. So he argues in the letters that education is very, very important. He says that, I think I may say that of all the men we meet with, 9 parts of 10 are what they are, good or evil, useful or not, by their education. So basically he's saying you are 90% made, your personality, everything about you is 90% the result of your education. So he takes basically a blank slate view.
What about the other 10%?
That's what you eat.
Yeah.
And when he says education, he means formal education at school?
I don't think he could mean that, because most people at the time didn't have formal education. And in fact, the friend that he was corresponding with was talking about his son being privately tutored, so it wouldn't be a formal school education necessarily.
Yeah.
But he also had some interesting ideas. He said that... so he took this blank slate view, but actually he said that parents have to recognise the innate talents of their children and should watch their child to discover and nurture their aptitudes. So he said people have natural inclinations towards things, and you should try to focus on those and improve those rather than trying to force them to do things that they're not inclined to do.
Yeah. Do you think it happens that some people, despite receiving no encouragement or even being discouraged from pursuing something that they're very passionate about, will still find their way to it anyway?
No, I don't know if that's... Well, maybe as a parent, maybe you need to... Not a parent or a teacher, I guess. You need to kind of find their talents. Maybe.
Well, that's kind of what it's saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. But do you think that's necessary, or does it depend how strong that passion is in the child to start with?
I don't think anyone really knows, do they?
No.
Like
That's my point.
people always put the example of Mozart. They say, he just sprung out as this musical prodigy and he composed stuff when he was 5 years old.
Yeah.
But he was actually like really trained in music all the way through his like very early childhood.
Right.
So
And Picasso's father was an artist who...
cut off his ear.
No. But, who gave him paintbrushes and pens from a very young age.
Okay. So that was his general view. He also believed that one of the main roles of education was to instill critical thinking and virtue in children. In fact, he thought that was the main point of education. He said everything else, and he cited second languages, actually, he cited languages, everything else is nothing unless you first instill critical thinking and virtue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do we know how he defined critical thinking?
He didn't use the phrase critical
Yeah.
thinking, but basically what we would now today recognise as critical thinking, like assessing things. He was an empiricist.
Yeah.
In terms of second language education, it wasn't a large part of the book, but he did mention it, and it's the part that's most relevant to us. So he was against the teaching of explicit grammar rules to children. Mm-hmm. So again, Latin, as it was taught at the time, was explicit grammar rules, and then bits of like writing poems and things like that using the language and being corrected and so on. So he believed that memorizing grammar rules was an unnatural way to learn language, and he said, "I would fain have any one name to me, that tongue, that anyone can learn or speak as he should do by the rules of grammar. Languages were made not by rules or art, but by accident and the common use of the people." So he's basically saying language is a natural thing that develops naturally, and learning grammar rules is not the way people learn languages. And also prescriptive grammar is not natural because people or languages evolve by accident and by common use. Yeah. So he was still talking about learning Latin here, because that was the language that the son of Edward Clarke would have to learn. And he was talking about a child with a private tutor, so saying the private tutor should speak to him in the language. But of course he realised that that's impractical because it's a dead language. So he said, and also for most people there wouldn't be enough teachers who could learn it to a high enough proficiency to speak anyway. Right. So he said the best way, the most practical way for most people would be simple grammar study, and then lots of reading and translation.
Okay.
So the input hypothesis becomes grammar translation and extensive reading.
Right.
But an interesting point was that he said that teaching Latin was a waste of time.
Okay.
Because it was a dead language, and because it was only taught to people because of tradition. And he said even like very poor, people out in the countryside will send their children to grammar school to learn Latin when, that's not going to be of any use at all. So he said it would be better for students to learn living foreign languages. So in summary, he was against prescriptive grammar rules. He thought it was better to learn living than dead languages. And he said there was no need to study grammar rules. You should take a natural approach. But because that's impossible with Latin, you should do grammar translation. His book was one of the key texts that influenced 18th century educational thought. And according to Wikipedia, it survives to the present day and is the basis of Sesame Street. According to Wikipedia.
How?
I don't know. It's what Wikipedia says. I think that might be a vandalism edit, but that's what it says.
So Sesame Street focuses a lot on like play, for example, and enjoying your learning.
And I guess Sesame Street also tries to improve virtue in children. It tries to impart moral lessons, that kind of thing. So I think that was the point that was the big focus, was the focus on virtue and critical thinking. That was what really influenced education at the time. And that's not really something... I mean, critical thinking is something that a lot of people focus on, and we have our perhaps issues with that. But I don't know. I don't teach my students moral values, because I teach grown-ups. So Locke died in 1704 at the age of 72. And he's remembered as one of the great philosophers of his time. So that's our TEFL pioneer, John Locke.
TEFL cultures.
So today's TEFL culture is it's a very general, broad topic, but one very important, I think, for what we do, and that's the topic of assessment. So obviously the easiest thing to maybe focus on is testing, but I think maybe starting very, very generally, just in terms of when you put together a course for your students. First of all, at what point do you think about assessment? How do you think about assessment? Go.
For me, it's usually the last thing I think of.
Okay.
Yeah, because I don't like tests really, as I would not like to be tested, so I do not like testing others.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do you think is the purpose of testing?
Depends on the test.
Okay.
I think often it's to fulfill an institutional requirement.
Mm-hmm.
I know, like, you know, to show the learners have learned something, but I don't know how well tests show that. You know.
Well, assessments, they show how much a student has surely learned your course. If you're going to design a course, then you want some way to kind of record what's been retained by the learner, what's been...
Yeah.
So in that sense, that's what an assessment is in terms of course design.
Yeah.
But if you're teaching language, is it how much they've learned of the language, or how much they've learned of your course, or how much they've retained, or it's a bit diffuse, I think.
So you're saying potentially there's no need for assessment in a language course?
I don't know.
Right.
Potentially, yeah, because the only reason you'd necessarily have assessment is to meet some outside criteria, right? Or inside criteria.
Yeah.
You wouldn't necessarily need that. Like when you go to a private language school, the only reason they have those tests is really to make the students feel better, that they've tangibly improved in some way.
I think like having assessment gives some impetus to learn as well, arguably. You know, if there's a test coming up or a speaking, any kind of assessment, surely makes the learners want to study harder. So in that sense, it serves a purpose.
Yeah. Does it make the students want to study harder, or does it just make them study harder?
Well, I'm sure. In terms of learning, I think there's learning will take place. It's kind of positive. Positive washback. Arguably, that's one sort of factor of assessment, I think.
Right.
Yeah. I get maybe what you're talking about would maybe more be some kind of extrinsic motivation.
Right. Yeah.
But I guess some kind of washback as well. But washback, I guess, then would depend on how closely the assessment matches what they're doing in the class.
Right.
Yeah.
In terms of designing a program, I think the assessment came secondary to like actually trying to design a whole program first.
Yeah.
And then you make the assessment fit the program in some way. I don't think I've ever gone the other way and said, here's what we're going to be assessing, here's how we're going to do it, and then how are we going to achieve those aims.
In content courses, that quite often is the way that it's done, because you have to have a goal at the end. You have to acquire a certain amount of knowledge.
Yeah.
It's almost like language works kind of backwards, and it in a way it kind of shortchanges the students if you say, well, you know, this essay, this assessment that everything kind of hinges on. That we're just doing that as a last minute thing. You know.
I was thinking it'd be great just to not have any sort of assessment. Just like all the students that turn up and perform and will get a grade of some sort. And I don't really care if they fail, because
they might.
What I mean is I don't want to like be worrying about giving them the correct grade. I just want to make sure that they come, they learn something meaningfully, they contribute.
But how do you know whether or not they have learned something meaningful?
Well, that's their.
Okay.
What I want to instill in them is it's for them, it's for their benefit.
Right. So like you said before, maybe they, like some students, or maybe many students, at the end of a course would, maybe just because of what they're used to, they'll look to the teacher and they'll ask the teacher, so like, how did I do?
Yeah.
Did I learn what you wanted me to learn?
Yeah, and you say, well, surely you know what you've learned. And
Right. But do you think students need to be trained to actually reflect in that way?
Yeah. So maybe reflection comes into assessment as well. The ability to know what you've learnt, maybe.
Okay.
Right.
Which is very rarely assessed. I guess
that,
I guess can-do statements are good in that sense. Like having can-do, what have you achieved would be a good way to assess.
Yeah, I'm a bit sceptical of can-do statements as well. I think there's a lot of wiggle room in those. Like,
right,
can
it's
you
very black or white, yeah.
Yeah, but it's also like, can you accomplish a task, not how can you accomplish a task.
Right. How well
Do you know
did
what I
you
mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, or like, did you accomplish it using what we wanted you to use? Or, you know.
Yeah, I mean that's why they're often very long statements.
Right.
Do you have any experience with language being tested on your language or language tests?
The JLPT, the
Okay.
Japanese Language Proficiency Test.
Okay.
For those uninitiated.
And why did you decide to do that?
Because I wanted some tangible evidence that I'd improved, because it was an extrinsic motivator, because I'm not good at sitting down and studying, but sitting down and studying in the direction of something with very well prescribed targets was useful.
Yeah.
So that's a motivation for learning.
Yeah, but that's something that I chose to do myself, not something that was imposed on me.
Right. So there are a few kind of distinctions made in assessment or in testing. So one is summative versus formative. So summative is more or less what it sounds like. So at the end of the course, a test to see whether or not they've learned what you want them to learn, is the idea at least. And formative is maybe as you go along. And the testing there is obviously the feedback on the test, on how they did on the test, is very important, because the students would take a test throughout the course and look at mistakes they made on the test and then be able to fix those. So it's actually part of the learning process.
Right. Then that throws up questions of needs analysis, and assessment can surely, like you said, assessment leads to the way you construct courses. Often.
If it's a formative assessment.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So if you can find those gaps, you then make a course based around what the learner's needs are.
Yeah.
So going the other way, going from a bottom-up approach.
Right. So, yeah, I think it can kind of go back and forth. So if you start with what your aims are, what you want your students to be able to do by the end, and then designing the best test you can or assessment along the way and also at the end, but then also that'll play back into how you teach the course. Another distinction is made between norm-referenced and criterion-referenced tests. So at a very simple level, norm-referenced is basically, but both of them refer on a very simple level on how you interpret the results. So norm-referenced, basically all the students who take the test are being measured against some kind of, either against all the other students who take the test with them at the same time, so grading on a curve, or on some kind of hypothetical, perfectly average model. But a criterion reference test is basically a test where all the students just get a score based on completely objective criteria. So again, the same test in theory could be either norm referenced or criterion referenced, depending on how you organize the results.
Right.
But a criterion reference is really, you want to see what the students are capable of doing. And ideally, all the students would get a good score. Whereas with the norm referenced, it's designed in such a way that you get a big spread. So those two differences play into the test design.
Right.
In terms of maybe more alternative assessments, do you know much about dynamic assessment?
No.
So what is it?
It's it's almost it doesn't really feel like assessment to me. It feels like it's more a type of teaching than assessment. So it is, I guess it's a type of formative assessment, but you're not, the only reason you're checking what students are capable of doing at all is to then be able to, improve that aspect of their learning. So I don't even know if you'd call that assessment necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, teaching is assessing. You're always assessing. You're assessing how well you've made your point to the students, and you're seeing how well they've responded. So there's always assessment. Yeah, so that's kind of dynamic in that sense.
But it seems like maybe you would be more in favor of some kind of self-assessment for students. If what they should be assessing themselves on is clear enough to them.
No.
Okay.
I don't think I agree with that.
Okay.
Because I think there's too many problems with it. But again, it depends. What's the point of the assessment?
Mm-hmm.
What's the if it's just for a student to assess their own level, then that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with self-assessment would be that a student could imagine that they're good at something and valorize themselves, but actually not be very good at it.
Okay.
But if you're talking about some kind of institutional thing, then, well, I guess you've got the same problem if you're using self-assessment. Basically, I just don't like assessment as a thing. But I kind of know it's necessary, but I don't like it.
Why not?
Because I don't like measuring people.
Okay. But if the assessment is whether or not a goal has been achieved, or if it's what you set out to do has been done or not,
it's not just about awarding a grade,
right? But I mean, if we're talking about generalized assessment, then I think it's important. If we're talking about language assessment, then I don't particularly like it. Like for example, when I was studying sociology, the point is, do you have enough knowledge to get to this level, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, fine, okay. Right, but if you're studying grammar rules, have you memorized all the grammar rules, or have you learned the vocab in this list?
Mm-hmm.
Then fine.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's like, how good are you at speaking?
Yeah,
it's just a bit too generalized, and I've seen a lot of people being like really upset because they didn't meet the criteria of tests that I didn't think were very good and didn't necessarily capture all the complexity of their speaking selves.
So your issue is more just that it's maybe we don't have a good enough assessment tool to be able to measure everything that's involved in using a language.
Yeah, and I think it's a bit kind of reductive, and tests don't account for, I guess, the more sort of emotional side of language use.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
sounds like we solved the issue of assessment and language teaching.
We all passed.
TEFL News.
Okay, so for today's TEFL News, we're going to, like everybody else, we're going to talk about Donald Trump and what he's been up to recently. But I don't think, in many quarters, I haven't heard what the implications are going to be for TESOL and the teaching of English in
I think it's not
America.
where most people are focused, to be honest.
And it's not, maybe it's a bit more, there are more pressing issues, which we'll come on to, obviously, but they are not everything, but they do relate to the teaching of English in some way.
Mm-hmm.
But more largely, I guess, education in America.
Yeah.
And in the past month or so, the TESOL organisation, the international organisation of TESOL, has put out some press releases. We'll talk about the two press releases they've made. The first one of which is kind of an open letter to the Trump administration.
Yeah, that was even before he was inaugurated, as far as I know.
Yeah, this was the one that I've got here was dated the 19th of January.
Yep,
so that was just before
the inauguration.
Yeah, and they kind of set out what they'd like to see from the administration. And we'll talk about that.
Yeah, I don't know, but presumably or possibly this is something they do to every new president, every president.
Yeah, I'm not too sure actually, but I know that there has been a lot of organisations that have sort of written open letters to Trump.
Do you think he's read them?
I don't think he has, no.
Yeah.
And so I think, like we've seen, people are taking other actions these days, taking to the streets and all that kind of thing.
But I think these types of letters, which are written before the president-elect becomes president officially, there's nothing necessarily controversial about them or combative about them. I think they're doing it with the understanding that this person is about to become president and maybe giving them a fair chance to start with.
Right.
Yeah, which maybe he hasn't taken. But
you've lost half our audience.
I'll read the opening paragraph and then we'll go point by point. As you and your administration, they're referring to Donald Trump, prepare to take office, one of the many areas of responsibility you will have is to support the US education system and making sure that the needs of all learners in the US schools are met. On behalf of the TESOL International Association, I'm writing to urge your administration to continue the work of federal government to ensure that English learners receive the educational opportunities they need so that they can fully contribute to the United States, and that English language educators receive the support and resources needed to serve all students.
Yeah, it's not happening, is it?
Is it not? So I guess maybe the most obvious issue is his appointment as of the Secretary of Education.
Betsy DeVos,
Yeah.
is that her name? Yeah.
Who is so far been mainly criticized on the grounds that she has no experience with education. In terms of education management.
Yeah,
at all.
and also doesn't appear to know anything about it, really.
Right.
And also hates it as well, is another thing.
Yeah, and has and specifically no personal experience at all with the public education system.
Yeah, she was privately schooled, I think.
Yeah, and all her kids are or have been as well.
They talk about, in this press release, they talk about some of the acts that I presume were previously passed by the Obama administration, or maybe even before that. And I think what they're asking for is just for these acts to be upheld and continued.
Yep.
The first one is the Every Student Succeeds Act.
Yes. Yeah, that was signed under... I don't know the details much of it, but I think it was signed under Obama, and it received bipartisan support.
So I'll just read a little bit about what it says. This act marked an instrumental shift in the way our nation's 4.5 million English learners are assessed and how they obtain English proficiency and how federal programs support them and their teachers. TESOL members believe that the Secretary of Education is uniquely positioned to encourage state and local education agencies' efforts to provide high-quality professional development and ensure the academic success of English learners. What's unique about this act?
Yeah, I don't know many of the details either. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, the only thing I have heard about it is that it's maybe criticized more by people on the left.
Right.
Is maybe a continuation of the No Child Left Behind Act.
I was going to say Every Child Left Behind.
Yeah, that's the combination.
They talk particularly about teacher preparation.
Okay, yeah.
And I guess that's important for all kinds of teachers, not just English teachers.
Yeah.
They also mention leadership to be an important thing that they'd like to see maintained in terms of the Higher Education Act.
Okay.
Supporting the improvements in teacher readiness standards, licence standards, as well as investing in teacher compensation.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the issues to consider here is just that there is, I think almost everybody will acknowledge that the education system in the United States is far from perfect and needs to be continually kind of revised and looked at and improved, maybe on a very basic level in a lot of areas. And I guess the concern that people have currently is that the Trump administration may not be that interested in making the necessary changes.
Yep.
Just throw it all out. That's what I said.
They also talk about equal access and the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act and adult education. 670,000 adult English learners have benefited from publicly funded educational programs that enhance their English proficiency and skills.
So basically, just try to continue all the things that are currently going on.
It's a very general kind. It's
Yeah.
a very kind of general kind of tone that they're trying to set.
Right.
I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously this is TESOL, so their main interest is in English language education. Do they reference at all I know in California the issue of bilingual education is an issue, and it's something that Krashen has been
Right,
quite involved
So I
recently.
think in the future maybe we should speak to somebody more kind of closely related to these issues, perhaps.
Betsy DeVos.
Yeah, try and get her on. But the TESOL organisation kind of took another kind of turn recently, and they've kind of come out on their website, and this is in response to the so-called Muslim ban recently, that perhaps kind of undermines everything that TESOL laid out in their initial kind of letter to the Trump administration before he took office.
Well, maybe not everything, but maybe specifically in terms of language education in the States.
Yeah, and I'll read how they responded. This is on the 31st of January. The President of the United States recently signed an executive order that implements a 90-day entry ban for individuals travelling from 7 majority Muslim nations. This contentious act fails to satisfy its intentions to make the United States a safer nation, The exclusion of travellers, immigrants and refugees from these Middle Eastern and North African countries only serves to make the United States more vulnerable. And then they link this to how this will affect the world of English teaching. The immediate effects of this egregious executive action on nearly 17,000 students studying in the United States who come from 7 targeted nations should not be understated.
But I mean, what's that got to do with TESOL? I mean, like most of the issues for these people seem to be things like they're separating families. It's or they're stopping people who are fleeing from something from getting into the country, or people who are already green card holders, that kind of thing. How much of it is TESOL related, and how much of it is just general sort of human rights related?
Yeah, that's true.
But I mean, I guess TESOL is involved in the English education, maybe for a lot of immigrants and refugees, especially. Yeah. So I guess it's maybe they're just voicing their concerns because it will have some kind of impact on their community.
Right.
Just in terms of how big it is.
I think like what TESOL are trying to achieve here, because it's such an all kind of encompassing organisation, they're not just talking about language learning. They're just trying to kind of, I guess, show their position in line with Trump's, or out of line with Trump's position.
And I think, like you say, it will have an effect. Maybe not the same, as serious an effect as it will have on other areas of society, but it is. They do work with a lot of immigrants and people who've come from other countries, and like you say, they take it as their position, not just in terms of language education, but as being maybe like the part of the people who welcome. People from other countries to the United States, and maybe they feel that role they play is being affected.
I guess like language is the kind of the binding agent for kind of an inclusive society. So maybe that's kind of the angle they're trying to take.
Yeah.
I guess. Okay, so that's this week's TEFL news. TESOL responds to Trump. That's what I wrote on my paper.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast.
Don't forget, if you'd like to get in contact with us, you can send us an email at teflology@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter @TEFLology. Visit our website, www.teflology-podcast.com. That's where you can find all our previous episodes. And don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes as well. So it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye.